everyone, and welcome back. This is a very exciting week for me because it is the beginning of another grand project. I realized that I started my channel with historically accurate cosplay, but I haven't done it again in 6 months. So I am really missing this. And when a number of my friends jumped on the idea of doing historically accurate Disney cosplay all roughly around the same time, I knew that was just the absolute perfect thing, that I needed to do that at this point. The hard part, though, was deciding what character, because I do not really identify with most of the princesses in any way, shape, or form. So I wanted to do something a little bit different. I went looking through a lot of characters. I have a few that I'm still sort of holding on to as other possibilities for future videos, but for the moment, considering I had started to work on some 15th century clothing at the same time, it seemed absolutely perfectly appropriate for me to pick up and make Maleficent, because she is just such a wonderfully grand, amazing character with a very interesting costume that is surprisingly historically accurate. So I get to explore the 15th century and talk about all of that amazing stuff. And that is one of the reasons why I am so glad that my sponsor for this week is Magellan TV. Magellan TV is a new video streaming service that focuses on documentaries. I personally love watching documentaries when I'm gearing up for a historical project, as I get to learn about the world that surrounded my bubble of focus. The 15th century is a new time period to me, and I desperately needed a better concept of the culture and events that make up that century. Amidst binging detailed videos about castles and infrastructure, I was recommended a video on some of the more recent research being done on Joan of Arc. Though I knew her general story, there was clearly so much more to learn. It was honestly one of my favorite documentaries. They presented multiple viewpoints and opinions on how to interpret the documentation that does survive, which just made my historian heart so very happy. And I am nowhere near finished with diving into their library. It has over 3,000 videos on ancient through modern history, biographies and battles, and even science and true crime. There are no ads, and it's clear that every video was carefully chosen by a team who is passionate about these topics. Just click the link below to get a special offer as one of my viewers for your first month free, and you will be discovering all that Magellan TV has to offer instantly. So for this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about the historical accuracy of her costume and how I came to the design that I am using, and I'm also going to start by making her houppelande, which is sort of the large exterior garment that she is wearing. So we're going to get deep into the history of those and some of the construction techniques that I chose to use. But first, I feel like we should at least understand the history of Sleeping Beauty and the history of Maleficent, because like all fairy tales, there is a very interesting and varied past to this particular story. The story of Sleeping Beauty was, not surprisingly, not originally called that. This particular story dates back to at least the 14th century. That's when we first find versions of it written down. Obviously, it varies pretty widely from the version in the movie that we are more familiar with, or even the later fairy tale versions that you might have read. The more familiar version starts to come in the 17th century. The first version in the 17th century that was published, that we know of, was from Giambattista Basile's The Pentamerone. And this particular version was called Talia, Sun and Moon. And this does not have any fairy godmothers in it, evil or good. It is simply a fate that is placed upon the child, not a curse. The version that starts to bring in the familiar fairy godmother comes in with Charles Perrault and his Histoire au conte des temps passés, or Stories of Past Times. And this version is much more familiar to us and is actually the sort of initial foundation for the more modern version that we're used to. Of course, at this time, the evil fairy godmother does not have a name. She is one of 8 fairies, the other 7 of which are invited to the party to become the fairy godmothers of this princess and to bestow gifts on her. This final one is not invited, and she's a little salty about it. The next version that we might find a little bit more familiar, of course, comes from the Brothers Grimm, and they too include the evil fairy godmother, though they add a few more fairies. There's now 13 in total rather than 8. But in their version, Little Briar Rose, she still does not have a name. And it's not until we reach the end of the 19th century and Sleeping Beauty is turned into a ballet in 1890, and she is then given the name Carabosse. And it's from this ballet that so much inspiration was taken for the 1959 Disney version. In fact, they took not only a lot of the plot line and the story concepts, but they also took the music. Tchaikovsky wrote the music for this ballet, and it is beautiful, and you've all heard it if you've seen the movie, because most of it just transitioned over with some slight variations. In fact, the only original song that they retained for the movie was that of Once Upon a Dream. And there actually was a whole entire score written that didn't get used because it was a bit too musical. The movie itself, which was started in the early 1950s and didn't come out until 1959, was an artistic masterpiece, and that was the point. It wasn't just about the story, it was about the art. And you can really see that that inspiration of the medieval period comes into play. They use the colors and the stylistic nature of many art pieces from the 14th and 15th centuries. You can see that inspiration, and it shows through beautifully. It's very stylistic, and it's meant to be very modern, but still clearly have that callback to the original time period. So that sets us up for some really interesting character designs. And Maleficent, as she was named specifically for the movie, was a character that was meant to be very impactful upon arrival. The character was animated by Mark Davis, who is one of the big famous names of that era of animation, and she was voiced by Eleanor Audley, who also voiced the evil stepmother from Cinderella. So she put a lot of life into this character, as well as did the animators. And they went through different renditions for her. They didn't want her to be the standard evil queen that they had worked with before. And I highly recommend the video above if you want to learn more about Maleficent's character and costume designs throughout the years. But her original version was a little more bug fairy-like, and then they moved into adding horns and adding this very grand, large ensemble. The edges were very angular and pointed. It seemed like she had wings or fire. Some of the original versions had her in red and black, but then they shifted it over to purple so she'd be more regal and less expected in her color schemes. And it just turns out beautifully, but you can still see that there is heavy, heavy inspiration from the 15th century in her costume, which I absolutely love. Maleficent's costume greatly resembles artworks of the era where you see women wearing houppelande. There are some variations that occur within the design choices, which are done specifically to evoke a much more aggressive appearance. It's totally understandable why some things are going to get changed from the historical references, especially since they're looking at fairly flat images, not original garments, not garments that can move and function. They don't necessarily know how they go together. There's still very little research and very little information out there on things such as houppelandes. It's just not a time period we have a lot of content for. So I had to do a fair amount of research looking at a lot of original images, reading what other people had written about their experiences with making them, or staring at images for long hours, because there's a lot of mystery still involved in there. So we start by looking at the overall color scheme and textile choices. Obviously, it's an animation. I can't see detail. There's not going to be texture in the weave of the fabric. It's just not how this is going to work. But historically, very often, these were made out of a heavy wool, usually a broadcloth, which gives you the benefit of having no raw edge issues. So wool broadcloth does not fray when you cut it, so you can do all of this elaborate cut work and what they call dagging around the edges of the sleeves, and it's very quick and easy to make these garments up, aside from the fact that you are just dealing with yards and yards and yards of fabric, and therefore that's a long seam that's going to take a while. But they're big, they're heavy, they're very dramatic in their overall yardage, and that was the point. It's a way of showing off a lot of very expensive fabric. Wool broadcloth wasn't necessarily cheap. There were versions that were incredibly, incredibly expensive, and you do find other fabrics being used. There are damasks and other silks being used as well, but I chose for mine to stick with the wool broadcloth, so that way I could do some very lovely sleeves, and it just seemed like it would hold the appropriate weight for the entire garment. The lining is where we have to venture away from historical accuracy just a little bit. Very often these were lined entirely in fur. And for a long list of reasons, I don't want to do that. Not only because I don't want to deal with that much actual fur, that is a lot of expensive fur, a lot of hard work, and I don't need that warmth, I don't have that purpose, and I don't feel like that's a good use of fur if I'm going to put that much in. I also don't want to use a fake fur, not only because it is difficult, but because the interior of Maleficent's robes are purple. Violently purple, and I don't feel like I can achieve the look of Maleficent without that. Just putting in a white or a brown fur on the inside, it's just not going to be the same. And purple fur just... no. I feel like that would be more distracting and more silly than any other choices. So I instead decided to go with a silk taffeta in purple. It's a fabric that was very common in the time period. It was certainly very available. They could achieve very vibrant colors with it. And it's not so far outside of the realm of things that you would use to line garments of the time. So that's what I'm going with. It's a little bit of a stretch because I'm not going to necessarily be able to find examples of images or originals of houppelande that are lined with silk taffeta, but there's only so many images, they only have so much detail. So it's a little bit of a stretch there, but I feel like that is a reasonable adjustment to the historical accuracy for the sake of character in my case, and I definitely understand why they did that for the character design. Now, the version that you see on screen is just large. There are some openings, the front is split open, the sides seem to be open as well, so you can see flashes of this sort of magenta pink skirt underneath, and she has long buttoned sleeves that go down over her hands. So she clearly would have on, say, a kirtle underneath of this overgarment. I am going to roll this back a little bit for my sanity, and I already have a black kirtle that is appropriate to that time period, that fits me very well, so that's what I'm going to wear underneath. I'm not going to do the secondary kirtle layer that is in that magenta tone. This is just a matter of time and money for me. So I'm going to make that adjustment as well, but neither of those things are outside of the historical accuracy realm. They're very accurate. Moving back though to the houppelandes, houppelandes generally were belted in some format to help control the fullness. So it's a little bit different movement and silhouette than Maleficent has. These sleeves also are a slightly different shape. In the movie, they seem to be attached to the body, and the whole thing is almost like a giant cloak rather than a specific sleeved garment. Houppelande had lots of different sleeve options. I chose to go with this sort of long triangular style because it would allow me to have those dagged edges with a very fancy design that falls away from the wrist and goes straight down to the floor. These sleeves are only attached up at the armholes, not the whole way down, so there will be some variation in silhouette as I move, and overall allows me to get the textures around the edges that I need and the general size and movement of the garment. I also chose, not surprisingly, to go with slightly more accurate dagged edges. Now, they went with a very long, pointed appearance. It's very wing-like, bat wing creature, fire, all of those things get evoked by the shape of the edges of these sleeves as well as the skirt. She sort of slithers along with the way that her hem follows behind her. That's not quite the style of dagging that's typical for the era, so I chose to find one that's still got a little bit of a point to it, still has a little bit of that feel, but it's more historically accurate. It also takes a lot more time than her version probably would, but it looks really neat. So some adjustments were made to that particular part of the houppeland as well to sort of bring it up to historical accuracy. But surprisingly enough, not many dramatic changes need to be made to the costume in order to achieve a fairly historically accurate look that still strongly resembles the original character. Of course, her Houppelande is not the only thing that she has going on. She has a lot of accessories as well, including the most dramatic horned headpiece ever. Surprisingly enough, there's some historical accuracy there too. That is for another video. And I have to say, I am not the first to venture down the historically accurate Maleficent path. I'm not the first to do this sort of costume or this sort of design. If you have come across any of Claire Hummel's work with historically accurate Disney things, her Maleficent is just gorgeous. But I wanted to take it one step further than she did when it comes to historical accuracy, and further than most of the versions that I had seen as well, in terms of the final costumes, where they are still very much intended to be cosplay. I'm going to sit down and hand stitch this thing, make sure that I'm making it as accurately as I can with as much research as I can and as few exceptions as possible. So let's get started figuring out the shape of this Houppelande, because that's its own challenge. Again, we don't have original garments for this. There's a lot going on there. The costumes and just the general history of this era, there's so many gaps that we need to fill in. And that's one of the reasons why I try to do more research into not just the clothing of the era, but the 14th and 15th centuries in general, to understand what was going on in the world, what sort of textile trades were occurring, what the world was like, because there is so much history in that time period that we're only just now really starting to discover the story to. Since we don't have original Houppelande to look at, there is going to be some conjecture in how these need to be shaped. I've seen everything from entire full circles to much more narrow styles, and the exact style of Houppelande does vary throughout the century and based on region. I chose to go with a shape that ends up with about a half circle in fullness, which is pretty large. I based the upper part on my previous kirtle and Burgundian gown patterns. Burgundian gown hasn't been completed yet, but it gives me a good idea of shape around the shoulders. I then decided to make sure that the pattern used as little fabric as possible. I was working with a wool broadcloth, which is 60 inches wide, and that is the typical width for a wool broadcloth of the era. Other cloths may be 30 inches or 45 inches typically. This particular design and shape created a layout that wastes very little fabric, and that's something that I thought would be very important in an era where fabric is so incredibly valuable. And I ended up using less than 6 yards for this incredibly large Houppelande, and even the silk lining, which is a more narrow width, only used about 7. Of course, this meant that the patterns were incredibly large, and I ended up having to do most of the work on the floor. Fortunately, some of the pieces were small enough, like the sleeves, that I could actually cut them out on my sewing table. There was some piecing that had to occur for the backs, and in the case of the lining, the fronts as well. The seam itself will be hardly visible once the gown is on, as that sort of drapes down at the bottom. I also decided to do a little bit of reinforcement around the body area at the top of the Houppelande with some buckram. I didn't have any buckram in hand, so I needed to make some with an unbleached linen and some gum tragacan. Buckram is far more typical than other more common modern textiles for interfacing, such as horsehair. Horsehair is great for many things. It is really not commonly used on the interior of garments during this time period. So buckram really is the tailored interfacing of choice well into modern day. I chose to do this in part after watching Jane and Nina, who are the Tudor tailors, working on the Stitch in Time TV series where they made the Arnolfini portrait gown. They talked about how they had tried to get the pleats that are commonly found in certain types of Houppelande to stay in place around the waist. Some of the time they do look a bit more random, but many of them are very organized, and there's just no way that you could get that to work underneath of a belt without it moving about as the person moved. So there had to be pleats stitched into the gown. If the whole thing is lined in fur, they might be full and heavy enough to actually have the right appearance. So since I'm not lining it in fur, it needs a little bit of extra substance to it. And this may have been the case with fur-lined pieces as well, as they may have been able to do a more fitted lining using less fur. The buckram was then pad-stitched onto the front and back around the waist-hip area. This just holds everything in place nicely. I'm not doing diagonal stitches because I'm barely even going into the broadcloth. It's not a stitch that I want visible on the exterior, so I'm trying to take as little of a bite as possible and at that point it doesn't really make much of a difference if it's at a slight angle or straight. The rest of the body is then just seamed up, which can take a really long time for those links, and then I moved on to the lining. Before stitching the lining in, I need to make the collar. This, I decided, was going to just be a rectangular shape. It wasn't going to have any curve to it. Some of the portraits show it up buttoned around the neck or just very tall, others show it folded down. So it needs to be adjustable both ways, and it doesn't really look like it's bigger or smaller at the top. I just measured out the neckline size and created a rectangle that was about 4 inches tall because I figured that would be high enough to make it up to my ears, but not so high that it would interfere with the hennin headdress that I would have to make later. I chose again to use buckram in this for stiffening, though I did not pad stitch it. It's not really necessary. It's going to be held into place by the stitches to put the lining onto the broadcloth exterior, so it's not going to be moving anywhere, and I don't need to form a shape into it. I don't need to put a curve into this collar. It's just straight. So pad stitching on something this small would just be overkill. So if I was concerned about the buckram moving around inside of the collar, it would be better to whip stitch the seam allowance of the lining fabric down to the buckram, which is what I do on the interior part of the gown, where all of the seam allowances are whipped down around the neckline, shoulders, and sides, just to be extra sure that nothing is shifting around inside of the garment, since I'm not running the buckram into the seam allowances because it is so very bulky. Gathers I chose to do through the lining as well as the exterior fabric and buckram, just because I wasn't sure how else to finish off and gather up the lining in a way that wouldn't be a problem inside. I ended up using 5 rows of gathering stitches across both the front and the back, which were centered over my waistline. I separated them out by 1 inch, and then each one of the stitches is 3/4 of an inch long in order to make some cartridge pleats that are not too large. I ended up with 6 cartridge pleats per side, so 12 total in the front and 12 in the back. I based this decision off of the size of the cartridge pleats and the amount that I needed to gather the body up, so it was pretty well fitted to me. Of course, I can't gather it up the entire way, as gathering up to my exact waist size would mean that I would need the opening down the front to go much further than I was planning on it. I might end up having to change this at a later time depending on how easy it is to get in and out of this gown and how the belt interacts with the pleats, just because I will have to manually move some pleats around when I tighten the belt up. So this may be a bit of an experiment in progress. Sleeves, I had a very complex shape for the dagging. I knew that I didn't want to have to draw out an entire pattern piece worth of these shapes, so instead I cut a sample of 2 of them out of cardboard and used that as my tracing. All I had to do was mark out where the points should be the whole length down, so that way they were properly distanced, just in case I ended up working a little too far apart or a little too close together with my tracing. Since I am working with broadcloth, I don't need to finish the edges, I just need to cut them cleanly, and then the lining will have the edges folded over to match and stitched down. This does mean that I'll have to put lots of little relief cuts into my silk lining, just because obviously it's not going to make it around some of those complex curves very easily, but I also realized that with that many designs along the sleeve, especially as it's moving around, I'm not going to be concerned with making sure this is absolutely pristinely perfect, where all of my curves are smooth. Instead, what I'm focusing on is the impact that the shape, the repetitiveness, and the color is going to give to these sleeves. So in reality, though it looks like it's going to take me forever to do this stitching, it only took me around 4 to 6 hours per sleeve. Once I sat down and was actually properly focused, I just used a running stitch, folded back the seam allowance as I went, and tried to make it look as clean as possible without spending a lot of time trying to make it perfect when it really didn't need to be. I also chose to do the work on the sleeve while it was still open and flat. I had only stitched the seam that was on top of the arm. The seam that runs from the armpit down to the floor, I left open until the very end. This means that I was able to work on a fairly flat piece of fabric, making it a much simpler process. And all I did was leave the last couple of shapes down at the bottom undone until I seamed up both the lining and the exterior fabric, and then was able to cleanly finish off that last little design. Underneath the Houppelande, we have the woolen hose, the shoes I made back in December, and a linen smock that will help keep me dry and clean. Over these base layers, there's a fitted kirtle which laces up the front. This layer is tightly fitted so it helps to support the chest. It's a necessary middle layer when it comes to these ensembles, and it's very useful in terms of warmth as well. Even though this may seem like I am putting on a lot of heavy layers, remember that this particular style and fashion is coming from more northern European areas, and they are going through a little mini ice age at this time, so they need all the warmth that they can get, which means that the sleeves are long and tight, buttoned up to the wrists, and over this goes the very heavy and warm houppelande, which is belted about the waist to keep it under control.